Meet Jennifer. She's a writer who lives in New York. She's trying to get away from the city so she could write her book in privacy, so she heads down to Louisiana. She's planning on staying in an isolated cabin, so she gets the keys and directions from this guy, Earl. She's heading over to said cabin when she realizes she needs some gas, so she stops by a local gas station. Jennifer's a bit lost and asks for directions as well. This guy, Johnny, tells her how to get to the cabin, and he also flirts a bit before embarrassing himself like a clown. Jennifer hits him with that hot girl look of pity and dips. She arrives at the cabin and settles in. She gets straight to work, then heads outside to talk to her friend and vibe. Jennifer then hears a strange noise coming from a nearby shed. She goes over to check it out and sees a bunch of poisonous and dangerous substances. While she's washing her clothes in the sink, someone begins to record her without her knowledge. The next morning, she heads out for a jog. While on said jog, she notices a small abandoned cabin. She then heads back to her cabin and notices her plumbing is jacked up. She calls the owner and asks him to send someone over to fix it. This guy, Matthew, arrives and he has a very noticeable stutter, but he seems really nice. He fixes the plumbing and she rewards him with an abrupt kiss of gratitude. Matthew heads over to his boys and flexes a little bit. Meet Stanley, Andy, and Johnny, the gas station clown from earlier. All the men seem to have that cousin-loving vibe about them. Stanley shows the goons a video he recorded of Jennifer half naked. Johnny says Jennifer's a snob and they must teach her a lesson. Well, that escalated quite quickly. It seems his ego is probably still bruised from earlier. Later that night, Jennifer is having herself a beer and working on her novel when she hears some noises coming from outside. She goes outside to inspect the area but finds nothing. She heads back inside and sees the 4 goons have snuck inside her cabin, one of which is holding a bat. It seems they're here for nefarious purposes. Johnny and Andy talk smack while Stanley records. Matthew doesn't want to participate and it seems he's not a fan of the situation, but it also seems he doesn't have a lot of power in his friend dynamic. Jennifer begs the men to leave, but it doesn't seem they feel like it, and they continue to taunt her. Johnny then brings out the strap and assaults Jennifer with it. Wow, his ego must be really small. Jennifer eventually manages to escape into the woods. She runs into the local sheriff and tells him everything that transpired. He takes her back to the crib and begins searching the place. He finds some weed and alcohol and begins to doubt her story. He says he's going to search her and makes her stand against the wall and begins to quite inappropriately search her. Suddenly, the 4 goons from earlier walk in. It turns out they're friends with the sheriff. The sheriff begins assaulting her and ripping her clothes off. They make Matthew take his clothes off as well and try to force him to mate with her. Matthew looks super stressed and refuses. Well, for a bit, but eventually comes around and rapes her, choking her and everything. My man switched up. Stanley records the whole thing. The men eventually get distracted for a moment and Jennifer manages to escape. The goons catch up to her though and knock her down. They take turns raping her, and at this point I was thinking I can't wait till she gets her sweet revenge. And in this moment something seems to snap inside Jennifer. She eventually manages to muster up her remaining strength and walk towards the bridge. The crew follow her and start talking smack and laughing at her. The sheriff is about to shoot her when she jumps into the river to escape. The men begin to panic because they know if she makes it back to town, they'll probably be in a bit of trouble. They begin searching the entire area for her and we see the group dynamic in play. The sheriff seems to be leading this band of ruffians as he commands them to keep searching until they find her. He tells Andy to burn all of Jennifer's belongings in the cabin. He then takes Stanley's recording of the incident and calls him a whole clown for recording a crime anyway, like a snitch. He begins stomping on the recording. Sheriff then returns the cabin keys to Earl, telling him that Jennifer has left. Days pass and the men return to their normal lives. Except, well, for Matthew, who feels guilty for partaking in Jennifer's assault. He keeps having hallucinations of her and spends his time in the woods alone. A month later, Earl calls the sheriff and tells him someone from New York is looking for Jennifer. The sheriff tells him he'll talk to the New Yorker in the morning. The next morning, Stanley runs over to Andy and Johnny and he tells them someone stole his camera along with the tape of their assault. They stare at him like he's an entire buffoon for keeping the videotape in the first place. That night, Johnny's vibing in his crib when someone knocks on his door. He opens the door and finds Jennifer's sandal outside. Sheriff wakes up and finds out that someone sent the assault videotape to his wife. Lucky for him, she couldn't find a way to play it, but man seems stressed anyway. He drives over to Johnny and the goons and starts threatening them. He pulls a gun out on Stanley and says, "What's the dealio?" The men say they don't know what's going on and someone's terrorizing them as well. Andy says he suspects Matthew, who's feeling guilty about the ordeal. Sheriff orders the men to find Matthew by nightfall. They say yes, sirski. Earl and the sheriff are out hunting later when Sheriff decides to pop Earl to tie up any loose ends. Matthew, who's still haunted by the events, heads back to the cabin. He sees Jennifer, who's still alive but is looking mighty threatening. She looks at him like how Sasuke would look at Itachi in the first Naruto. Matthew begins apologizing to her on the floor and he's crying and everything. She stares at him and goes, "Nah, not good enough," and starts to strangle him. One down. Stanley and Andy head to the woods to find Matthew. They head to the cabin and run into Jennifer. Stanley starts walking towards Jennifer and steps on a bear trap. Unlucky. Andy goes over to help him but gets absolutely jacked up by Jennifer. Jennifer ties Stanley to a tree and begins to record everything, kind of like how he did to her. Ooh, revenge seems sweet. She pins open his eyes with fish hooks and smears fish guts all over his face. She leaves his camera on as crows come down to peck out his eyes. 2 down. She would stay and watch, but she has some more torturing to do. Jennifer ties Andy up and begins to drown him, but instead of water, she uses lye and burns his face off. That's 3. She heads to the gas station with her back turned to Johnny. Johnny goes over to spit some game and gets a fun little surprise. Bang! She hits him with that thang. She brings him to an abandoned cabin and ties him up. She pulls out his teeth one by one and sticks a glizzy in his mouth like he did to her earlier in the movie. She then grabs some garden shears and snips off his mating machine. Then she leaves him to bleed to death. And with that, it is 4 down. Jennifer then heads over to hang out with the sheriff's wife, posing as his daughter's new teacher. Sheriff is talking to his wife on the phone when she passes Jennifer the phone. He realizes it's her and starts going into full panic mode. He rushes home to confront her, but he learns Jennifer took his daughter to a nearby park. He drives over to said park ASAP, but can't find her anywhere. He rushes back to his car and gets knocked out from behind by Jennifer. When he comes to, he learns that Jennifer has stuck a shotgun inside his, well, look at this picture and tell me where you think it is. He then starts begging for Jennifer to release his daughter because she's innocent. She tells him that she was innocent too, just like his daughter, so what's going on? She starts setting up her trap by tying a rope from Matthew's wrist to the shotgun's trigger. Matthew wakes up and sees the sheriff is in quite the predicament. He immediately moves and bang, the shotgun goes through the sheriff and into Matthew, killing both men. And last one down. Jennifer, who's sitting outside, hears the gunshot go off and begins to smile. Remember kids, if someone wrongs you, get your revenge and make it sweet. And that's the end of our show, ladies and gentlemen. If you like this recap, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button for more videos like this one. Take care.